Hey folks, Steve here. Now is kind of an interesting time for the hobby. It just has happened to be that a game has been removed from GMT Games' P500 pre-order program, and it's caused the community a little bit of some grief because of the differing opinions on the matter, and um, I think it makes sense right now to leverage this as an opportunity to kind of talk about our hobby and the things that ultimately, you know, we probably ought to be thinking about. And I say this because, I approach the hobby from the historical perspective, seeking to understand historical situations better, to understand the motivations of various parties, or understand the constraints or the military operations that are driving, what options were available and how do you navigate through them, and just what are all the possibilities. And so, um, inevitably, that brings us to historical situations that are not necessarily easy to deal with, and are oftentimes um, very complicated, and deal with issues that can make people very uncomfortable. Um, so I wanted to, in this video, try to talk about this issue. Right now on Board Game Geek, there had been a lot of discussion. On Facebook, there's a lot of discussion, and I'm sure in other forums and in other places, this is being discussed with a lot of, emotion driving, I think, a lot of what's going on. Um, and unfortunately, I feel like there's a lot of um, irrational responses to what's going on here. So I want to take the opportunity in this video to kind of review what the situation is, kind of what information is available right now, which is it's getting a little bit tougher, and I'll explain why, to actually find information and try to coherently put together, what's happened and why it's happened, and everyone's going to have a different thought process on it and what their opinion is, but I think it's important to approach this in a logical manner and try to understand what's going on. So there was a game on the P500 pre-order program that was only added, I think, in the last couple of months. And I remember when it was added, I looked at it and I said, I'm not sure I'm really interested in this. And it kind of felt like the game was in poor taste or bad taste. And I kind of felt a little, I don't know. I don't think it looked great, but I wasn't about to lose my mind over it. GMT was publishing a lot of games that I liked. Um, and it was Scramble for Africa, a game that was ostensibly about the Scramble for Africa. And if you're not unfamiliar with that, you didn't get a good history lesson in school or something. It was when the colonial powers of Europe basically sought to exploit and take control of Africa, seizing different regions and looking to make money from these ventures. And obviously, it is a period of imperialism, and depending on how you feel about that, it's not exactly a great time. But there are a lot of historical conflict simulations and different war games and stuff that cover tough time periods. So why should we treat this particular game any different? Um, well, let's first all look at what GMT has publicly said about why they removed the game. So, dear P500 customers, I'm writing today to let you know that after much consideration, after consultation with the designer, we've decided to pull the game off our P500 list. It's clear to me that the game is out of step with what most Eurogame players want from us in terms of both topic and treatment. They had gotten a growing number of gamers who had concerns with Scramble for Africa, and basically, they had gotten some feedback from folks and decided that they weren't going to publish the game, right? And this is available from the GMT website. You can find their update, or if you get the newsletter, you may have gotten a copy of this already in your email and have read this. So Um, Stuff that kind of sticks out to me, right, with this is that that this game, Scramble for Africa, was a Euro game, and that from GMT's opinion, at least what they're publicly saying, that the game is out of step with what most Eurogame players want from us, both in terms of both topic and treatment. And I think just to kind of help level set that this game, Scramble for Africa, was not a con sim, was not a war game. It was a Euro game, and I'm going to walk you through some of the content that I can still find on the web about what the game was going to be like, so that we can really talk in some realities, because I think a lot of folks are jumping to conclusions out there, and it's making the discussion really kind of heated and ugly, and so we'll hopefully try to find some sanity here. So, GMT made a decision here based on feedback for the intended audience of the game to not publish the game, and it's tough when you see something like this where it's if you're removing the potential to get a game, that matters more than even a game announcement, because now you're saying to someone, well, now here's something you can't have, and I know that can be upsetting for people. And what it's doing is it's making a lot of people react in a way of like they want to make this a political thing. So and so part of the political spectrum is XYZ. And I don't really see it as a political thing, and I'll get into that a little bit more in terms of how I see the situation. But to keep the level setting going here, if you looked on GMT now, you wouldn't find the game's P500 page. You couldn't read any of the designer notes, but I had managed to find someone linked a Google Cache archive of the Inside GMT article for the developer's notes. So the game design is by Joe Chacon. I'm not sure, Chacon. And this article is written by Chris Miller. They, if you I'm going to try to put this link in the YouTube description. I'm not sure how long this cache page is going to be around for, but I'll let you kind of pause and read some of this on your own if you can get a good enough resolution in the video. And obviously, this is a game that GMT looked at and shopped, and that apparently the perception from some of the developers or the designers was that this game fits in that space between a serious war game and a family strategy game, and some might compare it to a Euro game. And I think in some of the P500 announcements when it was first added, it kept kind of referencing this Euro game. And so what makes a Euro game, I'm not going to get into that, but I think there's a certain level of difference in what a Euro game is trying to do and what a serious game on a historical topic is trying to do. You can kind of see a little bit, this article goes a little bit into the game mechanics of the game itself, and I know a lot of folks have been saying, well, how can anyone have any opinion on this being removed if no one knows what the game was going to be like? So if you're there saying, I understand why GMT removed the game, someone that might be saying, well, how we don't know what the game was like. How could you have that opinion? Well, this is, I guess, as close of a look into it as we can get at the moment. You can sort of see it looks like the map, various components. There's some chits, some cards. You can see little squares, meeples, and whatnot. And if you were to read through here, basically, the game is each player is a European power that explored Africa in the late 19th century. You're going to use your explorer piece. You're going to use a meeple on a blank map of Africa. And along the way, you're basically going to be uncovering tiles, placing your control cubes, basically doing what's referred to as worker placement on the map, drawing river tiles, and there are a lot of Euro games that are like this, where you're drawing terrain tiles and you're owning, wheat resources and that kind of thing. But where the game kind of starts to get into this weird space is, You're building plantations and logging camps and mining facilities, um, and I the issue I think that maybe some folks are encountering here is obviously the fact that there's a little bit of um, a airbrushing of the actual situation of what do you think it means when you build a plantation when a European power is taking over and exploiting Africa, right? I mean, there are a lot of things here that feel like they might be brushed over a little bit. Um, but you have all these different actions that are kind of economic actions. There are some cards that can come up, and I think someone I saw on some of the forums put it really well. If you've got an equal chance of drawing a card, and you're either closing a slave market or discovering some new species of animal that maybe we're not treating the slave markets with the right amount of due diligence and respect of the subject matter here. And really, as I look through some of this, it doesn't look like it's not openly offensive or anything, right? But it is dealing with this sort of difficult period, and it's not providing any further context of what was happening. And the fact that in a very jovial way we have our little meeples and our little control cubes and we're making plantations and logging camps and haha how much fun, when the scramble for Africa was a very dark and complicated reality. And I think some of the arguments I've seen regarding this is that, well, if you're removing the game, you're airbrushing and removing history. I don't think this game was going to teach you anything about the time period, other than, yeah, Europeans came to Africa and they made plantations and logging camps, and some of these various other things may have occurred, but it's not helping you understand the era. It doesn't help you understand the motivations, and it doesn't seem to really be supporting. You're not able to play as the indigenous peoples of Africa dealing with the imperial powers coming into the continent. And so it's very, it's in this weird place of a light-hearted approach to what was really a complicated and serious and at times very dark time period. And I think there are some arguments out here out on the interwebs of folks who are kind of, I think, rightly calling out that there are ways to look at this game. There are ways that this game could have been done maybe in a better way. But as a Euro game, it seems absurd to even be touching upon such a difficult historical time period that has a lot of issues in terms of how people were treated and the nature of empire, the vainglory of what European powers were doing in the continent, and that it just sort of washes a lot of that away. And you're doing it as a Euro as opposed to a more serious, designed and developed and researched game on imperial powers in the late 19th century, with some more nuance to it. And what's really interesting is that when folks are talking about this, I think they're hitting on some really important notes when it comes to the hobby of war games, because we play in this realm within the boundaries of what some folks may find acceptable. And what I mean by that is, I can take a game off my shelf today where I can play Nazi Germany and conquer Europe, or I can play a coin game or a game like Labyrinth, and I can potentially be playing as a terrorist faction and conduct terror. And somewhere along the line, depending on who you are, you're going to reach varying levels of what's acceptable, or what's worthwhile of a topic to have, or what's in poor taste and what's in bad taste. And I have I have multiple games on the war in Vietnam, and the Vietnam War impacts and troubles people today. The impacts of that conflict, to folks' mental health and to their life. Those impacts continue today, and so I can imagine various scenarios where having a Vietnam War game on my shelf could be seen as in bad taste. And so I think anyone who's involved in the war game hobby, we're already kind of playing in that field of, we're in these boundaries, or we're coming up against these boundaries of what's acceptable and what makes sense. And I think at least for a Euro game, and if it's the Euro game community that spoke out about this game and saying, GMT, this might not be a good idea to publish, probably comes maybe from the fact that these folks aren't, some of these folks may not be in that sort of spectrum of, playing games that we know at times may not be acceptable for everyone, right? There are games like Labyrinth and A Distant Plane that deal with very real conflicts that impact people today. And so what's appropriate, and why would Scramble for Africa in this case not be appropriate, while GMT even today, on their front page can include games like Caesar Rome versus Gaul, where the Romans came into Gaul and took control of their nation, or a game like Clash of Sovereigns, where thousands of people die on the battlefield, and to what degree is any of this appropriate? And fortunately, I think there's a line that can be drawn here, at least in some respect. And I've seen some really good responses that unfortunately have been removed, because on the Board Game Geek website, I can't even get to the game page anymore. It's now been replaced with this unpublished prototype page, and all the forum discussion has been removed. Oh no, here it is. Maybe I can still get. Maybe I couldn't access it because they were renaming the page, but there is still some threads out here you could try to read through, but a lot of comments, a lot of discussion. Moderators have had to delete a lot of comments. So what's the difference, right? How to approach even looking at this in terms of all these other games where you can play as Nazi Germany in the Dark Valley. What's different? I think there is a difference, a substantive difference between these different types of games. And if games trivialize a situation by being a game, obviously there's some floor of how to feel about that, I guess. But when I play something like the Dark Valley, I see that as, I'm not playing Nazi Germany, if I'm having to play the Axis. I'm not playing Nazi Germany because I like to be Nazi Germany, or I don't like to be the Soviet Union because I like the Soviet Union. I'm playing something like an East Front game because I'm looking to better understand the historical East Front conflict. I'm trying to understand the military situation better, and yeah, I'm gonna have fun along the way. And I think if you're a war gamer, you say that's just a part of it, right? You want to play a game that's fun, and ultimately, when you remove a counter from the board, I think we all kind of acknowledge that means that some volume of humans died, right? And I guess it's important, when you're playing the games to be. I try to be cognizant of that, right? That these aren't just cardboard chits in the reality of the situation. They weren't cardboard chits; they were real people, and you're playing through a simulation of it. And as a part of that, you sort of divorce yourself from the realities of it a little bit, and it helps because I've seen a lot of folks try to make this comparison of, well, why doesn't GMT get rid of all these World War II games if I can play Nazi Germany? Isn't that worse than European colonialism? I think the difference is that if I'm playing the Dark Valley, there's not the build concentration camp phase of the turn, right? These things that are, you know, the very darkest parts of our history aren't necessarily at the forefront of these war games, at least for a lot of them, because that's not necessarily what the game is about. If you said, well, is the Dark Valley about? Well, the Dark Valley, it doesn't, not to pick on a game here, I'm just using it because it's on the front page. The Dark Valley is not about the Holocaust. It's not about establishing concentration camps. It's not about, raping and pillaging. It's very much about a military operation simulation, and it's conducted as one. And that, I think, it is substantively different than a game whose victory conditions are basically such that who can exploit the people and the resources of this continent the most. And I think that's kind of where Scramble for Africa is sitting in, where all the players could potentially have been seen as the bad guys in any other sort of game in this regard, but where they're again giving this jovial attitude to conquering the continent and establishing dominion over it, and there's no opportunity to play as the native Africans. There's no more intense examination of the actual historical situation and the repercussions and the consequences of these things. They're not dealt with at all, right? You're simply placing your cubes, you're getting your victory points, and you're moving right along here, and that's really it. And again, it just this feeling of, this is a light, fluffy game, and the theme for this light, fluffy Euro war game, if that's really what this is supposed to be, a Euro war game, or maybe just a Euro game with historical. No, it's just, you're picking this theme that feels so mismatched. Now, one of the other comparisons that I was bringing up were things like a coin game where you can play as a terrorist faction, but a coin game isn't a coin game isn't set up so that all the players are all jihadists and they're all competing to see who can kill the most people, right? That's not what happens in a coin game. And in a coin game, what it's simulating, if you want to call it a simulation, or what it's trying to show, is the interaction of these different factions, both in parallel and in opposition to each other. And so, if you're playing a distant plane, yes, there is the terrorist faction that is causing trouble in Afghanistan, but in opposition to that, you're also playing the Afghan government. You're also playing the U.S. coalition forces there. The quote unquote good guys are there, and you're attempting to understand the situation. And even if one of the players is really the worst of the worst in terms of good guy, bad guy, whatever, what you're portraying is how these factions are interacting, and that's the point of the game, right? The point of the game is counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, and the designers have done enough research and have done enough design work to look at it and go, okay, well, I didn't understand. If you were living under a rock and you started playing a distant plane, you might be able to get that sense of, okay, I think I understand what's going on, that the insurgency in Afghanistan is very difficult to deal with if the coalition wants to be creating a stable government in Afghanistan, but you have these local terrorist factions or the warlords who are in here, and they're conducting what they want to be doing, and they want to reject Western influences or take down the Afghan government. They're obviously going to be acting in concert with the goals that they want to be achieving here. And what we're really experiencing when we're playing a game like that is how everything interacts with one another, and understanding better the context that these conflicts are taking place in. So even games with that incredible level of you know, what we might see as heinous actions that can be taken out by the player, again, it's set in a context that addresses it and offers alternatives to it, and again, is working to show the motivations and the capabilities of historical actors or actors that might be in the present realm in a simulation capacity, right? The next War Game series has cruise missiles, but the game isn't about can you cruise missile civilians. It's about are you going to use cruise missiles to disrupt military targets, and how fast can Russia invade the Baltic states, right? And all of that is within its own context and contained sort of in that understanding that this is what you're gaming, right? This is what you're simulating is this scenario, and these historical actors do have um, these drives, but for Scramble, for Africa, it's meeples and cubes and money points for mines and diamonds and are these blood diamonds? We don't know, but it's a diamond mine. And there's just this. I think the tone of the whole situation is off in comparison to maybe what we would expect from a game that could cover the time period. So I think there's folks that are glad that GMT pulled it, and I guess I'm on that side. I think to me there are plenty of Euro games, and GMT can publish Euro games, and they can be great. But if you're going to do a game on this subject matter, if you're going to do a game set in this time period, there's probably a better game that does better justice to the subject matter, does better justice to the history than this game would have done. I don't think someone could play this game and really walk away with a better understanding of the time period. Or if they played it and thought that they did, they might walk away with a really biased perspective based purely on the, hey, European powers came to Africa to make money, and I did really well because I made the most money. Haha, great. I don't think that that's not necessarily what someone should walk away from the time period and looking at this time period. I don't think that's the right takeaway from it. I mean that there's a part of it where if powers are competing for money and whatnot, that's an aspect of it. But there's a better game to be had for this time period than maybe what this game was going to be. So I reject the notion from I think some parties online that are saying that folks want to censor and whitewash and remove the history, and they're censoring it because of this awful backlash of people who don't care. No, I think I think a part of it's people who do care and would like to see this part of history done proper justice and done with a little bit more care than a jolly good romp through the jungles of Africa or something. There's probably a better game to be had here. And there are older games that cover this kind of stuff. Pax Britannica is in the vein of European powers sort of spreading their imperial influences and taking control of regions. And I think, the existence of those games from decades ago even, and most of these are from decades ago, these existing games, their existence doesn't justify a Euro game that doesn't do the subject justice, right? I mean, just because Pax Britannica exists and was published decades ago does not make it okay or make it, acceptable to make a game that's just out of step tonally with the history and what could be portrayed here. Some of the arguments being made by some folks are that GMT is being pressured by various parties to do this and it's censorship. But, I think there's a certain level of care that GMT takes in publishing what it publishes. And, I think folks need to understand that if we're looking at this, again, I'm trying to be as rational as possible about the whole situation. There's an attitude of, well, if you don't like it, don't buy it. And I understand that. That's a pretty straightforward thought, right? But that's purely from our perspective as war game consumers or uh, game consumers, because we say, well, if I don't like bulge games, I just won't buy Ardennes 1944. And that's, I might not like Battle of the Bulge games for whatever reason. I'm probably not going to contact GMT and say, don't make any Battle of the Bulge games. I'm not going to buy it, right? I'm just not going to buy it. It's not of interest. I'm not going to buy it. Banish the Snakes, I'm not terribly interested in, so I'm not going to buy it. I'm not going to ask the GMT not make it. But when it comes to something like Scramble for Africa, I think GMT could and should have a discerning eye um, in what it publishes, because every time GMT publishes a game, they've got their little red box, their name attached to it. And in the role of a publisher who has control over what they put out and what they apply their name to, um, I think there's a value in being careful of what name is attached to what. So this is, I think, somewhat a case of, hey, GMT, are you sure you really want to publish this game about this topic, that it's in this way? Do you want to be that game company? And GMT can look at that and look at the situation and say, well, maybe I don't want to be that company that did this, because once it's out, and they have to deal with this far into the future. So any additional scrutiny that the game gets, GMT's time and resources will be spent dealing with the fallout from it. And so if a way to avoid that and to simply, as a business decision, because that's what this is a business decision, to pull the game from their pre-order listing, is basically a way to avoid problems down the road and keep moving forward with what their normal business operation procedure is, right? They're looking to save themselves some grief, because it's going to cost them time and money to deal with this if they were to publish the game, and then there's a bunch of other backlash about it later down the road. Obviously, there's a lot of visibility on the subject right now, and me doing a YouTube video about it probably is only contributing to that. But I think if you're GMT, you need to keep in mind that what you publish is putting your name on it, and you are allowed to have some concern over what you publish and how you're seen because of what you publish. And if a customer ahead of time is coming to you and saying, hey, this seems really out of step, and this doesn't really seem of the right attitude, GNT can look at that and get that customer feedback and say, well, rather than take a misstep and have to correct it, why don't I just not take that misstep? And sort of, there's an implication here saying that they didn't catch this sooner, and maybe had they done that, they could have avoided this, and maybe they looked at it initially and didn't see a problem, and they got some negative feedback, and then now they are addressing the problem, so that maybe there was already a misstep from that perspective. But the sooner they deal with it, probably the better for the company. And so that this weird, I'm seeing some just really weird responses about GMT being coerced into doing something. I don't think that's what it is. I think they're looking at it, they're seeing that there's definitely some negative opinions on what the game is doing, from a historical perspective, from a tone perspective, that this seems really out of place, even with all the other games, all the other war games and historical simulations and games involving terrorism and nuclear weapons and everything else that you can look at those as simulation what ifs and various different scenarios, where this is purely trivializing a time and a conflict that even today has a lot of wide-reaching impacts. And I think the word trivialize is really the important one here, because when I play A Distant Plain, if I play Labyrinth, if I play any World War II game, if I play an American Civil War game, I don't think I've ever played a game and walked away from it feeling like the game has trivialized that conflict. And I think it's a point of pride for designers when they're able to take the subject matter and create a game that reflects the period, that shows you the motivations and capabilities of the actors, and provide that bandwidth of what if strategy that allows people to interface with history a little bit and try to understand the situation better. I don't think that the Scramble for Africa game was going to do that for anyone. I don't think it was going to have the historical detail um, and the care and research required to avoid trivializing the Scramble for Africa. I feel like it was going to not be able to do that. It was going to trivialize these things. Other folks are having that similar thought. And it's good for GMT to nip something in the bud before, some year down the road when the game is finally published, where they're now fighting off a bunch of issues with um, the bad press that could come up, or how the company is viewed, that GMT is the company that publishes these things. And I know that's going to be a knee-jerk reaction, is going to cause a knee-jerk reaction for some folks who are saying, well, so-and-so's a snowflake, or why can't they just deal with it? And, again, everyone has that level of what they find acceptable. And I think for this, could you imagine a game, a Euro game with worker placement tiles and meeples, where all the players are Soviet officers conducting the Holodomor in Ukraine, and everyone gets the most victory points by starving the most Ukrainians? I don't think that would be a very acceptable game for people. I don't, someone likened it to a train game, an 1800s train type of game about the Holocaust. Would it be okay to be playing a game, again, a Euro game with very light history and just a lot of, Euro mechanics, where the players are trying to accumulate cubes in their square, and the cubes represent Jewish people and other people who were put into concentration camps, and the players are trying to get their cubes in their box, the box being their concentration camps, and the person with the biggest concentration camp wins. That seems like a game that is not a very not a very in good taste game, right? I mean, I don't know of games that do that, and if they exist, they are surely weird self-published games that are played amongst neo-Nazis or something, right? I mean, there's a certain point where there's some subject matter that, unless you're being again very direct and nuanced and treating the subject matter with the right level of respect, it's going to come off as looking kind of bad, and it's going to feel bad. It's going to be a weird situation to try to be playing that game or publishing that game when it's viewed in that way. And obviously, the Scramble for Africa in the historical event isn't the same as the Holocaust. It's not the same as a Holodomor. It's not the same as various other things. But there are atrocities. There are actions that were taken. There are the rape and pillaging of cultures and lands, and it's a difficult situation. And so if you were going to play a game about this, you would probably want it to be a little more nuanced than that, Jewish people in a concentration camp type of game, right? I mean, that we want to treat the subject matter with respect, and we would want it to be more serious, right? I mean, I'm sure some folks may disagree, but I have to hope that that's what folks would similarly want out of the situation. So I do think there is a good way forward. I think it might be a little early to say exactly what's going to happen next, right? I mean, it could be this game is off the P500 and it stays off, and that's the end of that, and everyone, laments it until the end of time, I guess. But, I think with the right discussion that's happening, what we could see is, maybe the designer um, taking a pause and working with GMT sort of behind the scenes to redevelop the game from whatever it is now to this weird, between a serious game and a family strategy game, to redo the game, redesign the game to be that better, more seriously researched and designed game that helps reflect the realities and the historical context of what's happening here. Um, I think that could still happen, and we could still see this game, and it could be a different game at that point. It might not be a Euro game. It could be, um, a geopolitical game. Could be a coin game. It could be other things. We could still see that game come out. It's a possibility. I hope that's what happens. I hope that the designer, is able to get a game out. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with the designer. I'm not sure if his name's still up on the page now, but you know, uh, I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that person. I don't think there's wrong with the developers. I don't think anyone who played this game as a prototype and had fun with it are bad people or anything like that. I just, there's a point where this could be a better game that does the time period justice. If the online feedback to GMT is that let's redesign the game. Let's have someone redesign the game and try to make it the game that it could be. Then get it back on the P500. I think that would be a good thing. And I think it would require the designer in GMT really putting that extra effort in to say, we took all feedback to heart and this is what we're doing about it. I think that would be very cool of them to do that. But I know that would be time and resources spent, and maybe they may not have the bandwidth to do it. And I think folks need to keep in mind that even when it was on the P500, this game only had a couple hundred pre-orders. It had not reached the 500 mark. It sort of, gotten up to 200 over a couple of months and then was kind of stagnant for a little bit, it seemed like. And so, it wasn't like here's this game with 3,000 pre-orders and there's this whole wave of people waiting for the game to come out. It was sort of this weird product that folks were at least optimistic about trying, and they pre-ordered it, and now maybe they won't get it. This game maybe doesn't warrant the time and the effort to go that extra mile, but I think it'd be nice if it did, and I'd like to see the potential for that. I do think a game on the subject and a game on the time period is worth having and worth exploring. It just probably needs to be done in a better format than a family Euro game, honestly. And let me see if there's anything else I think worth bringing up here. This is getting a lot of people's blood boiling. There's a lot of lizard brain knee-jerk reactions to this. Again, people want to drag this to a political place, and I don't think it needs to be. I think we could see this game in the future in another format. We'll see what happens. At the end of the day, when we play games, I at least try to be thinking about the context in which these games are being, whatever story or narrative that the game's providing. What is the context for it? Why does it matter? What's important about it? Is there something that's being missed that's really a critical part of that story? It probably, again, would be in poor taste to play a World War II game where, as part of your invasion of Eastern Europe, you're rounding up people and putting them in camps, right? I mean, it's just one of those things that you try to do something justice, but you don't ever want to put a player in the driver's seat of um, a heinous act without at least additional context around it. And it's a sticky area. I don't think there's a pure, absolute way to look at this. And at least in this case, the target audience of this game did not necessarily want it, at least in this format. So, yeah. Going forward, we'll see what else comes out of this. And it could even be we'll see this game come from another publisher. I think a lot of people are getting upset at GMT Games and threatening to cancel pre-orders over this, and I think that's a bit silly. I think that's a bit juvenile, mostly from the perspective that, if you want to shoot yourself in the foot by depriving yourself of a historical war game that you were going to probably enjoy because you're not going to get to buy this game that you maybe weren't going to play anyway, I mean, I think that seems silly. For the folks who are, super excited for this game, there's other possibilities out there to come. If you're into Euro games, I mean, there's a lot of other good Euro games, I guess. So it just seems one of these things where it's not the end of the world, but there's so much discussion around it that, again, I think it's worth thinking about, even in your own time, to sit back and consider, what is it about historical war games, if that's what you play. Why do you play them? What enjoyment do you get out of them? Is it purely an exercise in risk analysis and problem solving? I know that's one of the aspects that I like about war games. Is it an exploration of history? That's one of the other reasons why I like it. I'm sure there aren't people who are, maybe there are, people who are playing these games purely because they like the idea of killing thousands of soldiers, right? I mean, I don't think that's why people enjoy war games. And so, I think there's a little bit of worth in self-reflection and saying, well, what am I getting out of this and why, and what am I okay with? And I'm sure there's going to be people who are okay with the worst types of things being portrayed in a game. And again, having played games involving terrorism and nuclear weapons, and what would be probably civilian casualties in the millions and stuff like that, there's a certain level, I think, again, of, if you're looking at something from a military operations standpoint, you're being decidedly neutral about that. You're not endorsing the collateral damage. You're not endorsing terrorism, and you're not endorsing nuclear weapons when you're doing this. But there is something different about this jovial little family Euro game about exploiting Africa that just seems off. And it is different. It feels different. And obviously folks may feel differently about that. Anyway, I wanted to put this video together because it's been on my mind since yesterday evening. And I wanted to at least get some words out on it and try to help folks kind of understand what's happening. The Board Game Geek page for it is kind of gone. I think you have to go to this unpublished prototype, and then you can find some forum posts that are labeled Scramble for Africa. You can kind of see some of the discussion that was going on. Very heated, obviously. But hopefully, after watching this video, if you were unfamiliar with the situation, you understand a little bit better what it's about, why people are caring about it, why it was removed, what was the game going to be like if it was going to come out, and make your own decision on how you feel about it. But again, I feel like anything like a boycott is probably an overreaction. This isn't censorship. This isn't a campaign for someone to come and take your games away. It's simply looking at a game that was in probably poor taste and asking the publisher to take another look at it. And, again, maybe we'll get a game out of this eventually. It just could be in another form. So, I don't know, guys. tough situation, but well, we'll see what happens. Anyway, have a good weekend. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you later.